Christians going for the gold. Christ said, "Herein is my Father glorified, if you bear much fruit." Some will receive 30, some 60, some 100-fold. Some will receive wood, hay, stubble, but some gold, silver, and precious stone. Let's go for the gold. Today's podcast is about chapel train cars, churches on wheels. And it's an amazing story. And there used to be 13 of these cars that went around the United States from 1890s till mid-1940s. Hey, be sure and hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you on the other side. I want to start this off now by telling you how I found out about these. About 2 years ago, I was in Snoqualmie Museum of Trains, and they have a pavilion, and inside I think there's 5 different train tracks there, and they have old locomotive, old train cars. And the man there was running the place. He was talking to me, and I looked between the 2 train cars that were hooked up, I don't know, 5-6 feet between the 2 train cars, and on the track on the other side I saw a wooden train, and everything else is made out of metal, you know, and I just looking at that must be an old train car. And I noticed at the top it said big letters B-A, and I couldn't see the rest of it because of the angle I was at. And I thought, well, I know there's a B&O railroad, or used to be. I mean, B-A, what's that? And I back up while the man's still talking to me, trying to get a better angle. It was B-A-P. And I got B-A-P, what on earth? And I back up again, B-A-P-T. I said, "Sir, what's back here?" He said, "Oh, that's our Baptist train car. Would you like to see it?" So he took me inside, and it's olive wood, very nice. The original ones had 2 rows of pews. They were seat 2 people on a pew, and then an aisle, and then the other pews would seat 3 people. So basically 5 across plus the aisle. And the platform would be up about 6 inches higher, a little hand railing, an organ, a pulpit, and then a door. And the door didn't go back outside. It went into his church parsonage. And very cramped, a little bedroom, a little study, a bookshelf. And when he wanted to go to church, he opened the door. And when he wanted to go home, he closed the door. And the main part of there was about 60 feet, 50, 60 feet was the area where all these pews were. They could get over 60 people in there. And on big days, they would just park it someplace and preach off the back of it. And to sometimes crowds. Even Dwight L. Moody was on here and preached for 2 days, he said, from the chapel car. They were called chapel cars. Now, one of the amazing things about all this is it was free. Let me tell you how this all got started. There was a man named Boston Smith. He was a preacher, and in Minnesota, he started a Sunday school for the people there, and he called this area a village. It was a new town, and it went okay. It was an open-door Sunday school. And then winter's coming on, and if you've ever been in Minnesota, you don't want to be outside when it's cold. And so he was getting ready just to close it down. And then I thought, well, maybe the train station, because the town had no schools, had no place to meet, there was no building big enough, and there was a train station there. He thought, well, maybe I could use the indoor part of the train station. He asked. I've been a pastor, and I've started churches in a lot of different places. So this preacher, his name was Boston Smith, and his nickname was Uncle Boston. And there's some argument about how the trains that were on the train lines got started. By the way, there was 13 of these train cars, and 3 of them were Episcopalian, 3 of them were Catholic, and 7 of them were Baptist. But it started with the man named, at least the Baptist one did, Boston Smith. So he wrote a letter. Now, let me read you this letter he wrote to the superintendent of this railway station. And he says, this is from a book, "But with no church, no schoolhouse, no hall, and no room large enough to gather in on Sunday school purposes, a special request was made by prayer in our family. We felt sure somehow the Lord would work it out." He addressed this letter to the Division of Superintendent of the Northern Pacific Railroad, running through their town, and asked that every week, and if you're going to ask big, you might as well ask real big, every Saturday night a passenger coach might be sidetracked at the station, as the next express would pass through early on Monday and pick it up and take it, so he'd have it all day Sunday. Well, cheerfully, they granted him his request. You know what he did? You have not because you ask not. This guy had a thought. He wasn't willing to stop, and he got it going. And the novelty of the Sunday school inside of a railroad train car took off, and he'd have some big crowds there. Well, come springtime, you know what they did? They ended up building themselves a church. And he ended up with something else. Somebody had the suggestion, maybe we could build a train car ourselves and go all around the West, Midwest, to places where there's no church and preach the gospel. They went to mining towns, they went to logging towns, they went to tent cities, places where there's no church, and they preached the gospel, and sometimes crowds of thousands. Listen to this. Dwight L. Moody on 2 different days preached from the back of that train car up there where the steps, and he'd draw crowds of thousands, and he'd preach right off the back of that. And he rode in the first one of these that were made, and they raised the money. The story I was told, it was 10,000 ladies gave $1 a piece to build the first one, and it was $10,000. 10,000 ladies giving their $1 each, and the car was built, and they would take it out and go around to places in the Midwest and on the West Coast. Getting started by Boston Smith, and had an idea, and 160 plus churches were started by these train cars. And then through the years, I mean, the last ones that was used was in the mid-1940s, and you can imagine how many churches were started off from those, not to mention other churches that were in need of help, holding revivals, and a novelty idea of meeting in a train car that was for a passenger car brought a lot of people in. Now, the name of these 7 Baptist cars were Evangel was the first, and then Emmanuel, then Glad Tidings, Goodwill, Messenger of Peace, Herald of Hope, and Grace. Now, Grace was the only one that was actually made out of steel. I got to see the one there in Snoqualmie in Washington State, and it's called the Messenger of Peace. Now, they went from town to town free of charge. The railroads would bring them to where they wanted. They'd unhook them, put them on a sidetrack. They could stay there for a few days or even a few months, and depending how things went, and if they were trying to start a church or hold a revival, and logging towns, and also sometimes in the train stations themselves, they were able to preach. And then you can imagine people working there in some of these places they went. They were pretty rough, and the only thing they'd sometimes have in the town was a saloon. And then they had a preacher come up to them, says, "Get in the train car, and I'll tell you about Jesus Christ." And people came, people were saved, and God used it. Let's look here and see some of these things that have been written about it. Now, Boston Smith took it out on its maiden voyage, and he went to places in Minnesota, and for 6 weeks he held a Sunday school, and each time he said the car was overflowing with people. Then they went to a small place in Fargo, North Dakota, and the Baptist church there, and then in Jamestown and Bismarck and Mandan, North Dakota, then in Billings, Montana. There were many that came that had been in no religious service of any kind. We had good results in a place called Livingston, Montana. Then the Wheelers took it over from Boston Smith, and they started living there in that church parsonage for years. Anyway, he pulled over the Evangel, the first one of these chapel cars, into Everett, Washington in the spring of 1898. Several hundred houses existed on the city's fringes, and hundreds of men and women were sleeping in tents and crude shelters. Every hour of daylight, men labored to erect shipyards, factories, and mills, while others pounded spike to lay rails to connect their city with Tacoma and Seattle. These people had no graveyards, no jail, no school, no church. Now, I've been in Tacoma, Washington, all right? I've been in Everett, Washington. I lived up there in that area for, I don't know, about a decade, I guess. And these people that he's ministering to, some of them pretty rough crew. And now I want you to hear the same account given by a newspaper at the same time, and this is by the Everett Times. Now, it's 20 April 1992. This was given years after the fact, but on the same month, in April 11th, 1892, Chapel Car Evangel made history as the first church to hold a service on the bay side of Everett. The first service occurred even before saloons were running. On the night of the service, Wheeler baptized a young man from Philadelphia in the bay near the train car, and rejoiced. It was a beautiful sight. It was the first baptism, as far as we know, in that country. Amen. Later, they headed to the Lone Star Estate there in El Paso, Texas, and they would start a mission among the Chinese, as well as a Sunday school. The Wheelers would join again with Harry Hills, an evangelist, and the chapel car would see 23 people saved in their first meeting there. The Wheelers would baptize many of these the next day in the river. But life doesn't go on forever, does it? In 1895, the Wheelers would take a car back to California because their train, the Evangel, was having some repairs, and they went back home and took a train, not the chapel car, but a normal train. And on August 8th, the Atlantic and Pacific train they were traveling in hit a washout near Grand Station and derailed. The Wheelers were thrown from the car, and Mrs. Wheeler was not seriously injured, but and she gives a testimony about what happened. Quote, a sudden shriek of the whistle, a sudden putting on of the brakes, a crash, and it was all over. And my dear one had gone. There were several significant events in the tenure of the 5th Baptist Car, Messenger of Peace, which saw service in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Idaho, Montana, California, Oregon, and Washington State. Here's an interesting one from the chapel car, this Baptist chapel car called, quote, the Glad Tidings was the name of it. Charles Rust on the Baptist chapel car, Glad Tidings in Minnesota and Dakotas, handed out cards midday and midnight saying, quote, come just as you are, bare-armed, dirty, and work clothes. They came by the thousands. Preaching in large crowds was done by standing on the back of the car. Now, here's an interesting one about Glad Tidings. This is in 1911. He says that Glad Tidings experienced even more success in Wyoming. There, on January 8, 1910, Shoshone Dam project was completed, and people started rushing into the area, these homesteaders, and not having churches in these towns that were popping up. Anyway, he preached there a stirring sermon, followed by a basket dinner. In the afternoon, the Powell and Valley Baptist Church was organized. They started a church, and the crowning event was the baptismal service of Shoshone River, attended by a crowd of over 150 people of all faiths and no faith. As the evangelist led them down into the waters, the rippling waters, and laid them beneath the waves, the hearts of the parents and friends were thrilled with solemn joy and sang, shall we gather at the river? Amen. Now, I read some of these accounts. They didn't have a portable baptismal tank with them, all right? Now, you know, we're Baptists. We need more than a cupful to baptize somebody. We like to show the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ as symbolized through the water, being baptized under and coming back out. And they actually, in some of these places, they had to dig into the ground, picks and shovel, and said, go get your water, everybody help me, fill it up, and they baptized people in these pits in the ground. One place, they actually used a greasy garage pit to baptize people in. Well, I'm sure the Jordan River wasn't crystal clear either. Amen? Entries here. I just want you to get a feeling for what it was like going to a towns they'd never been to, passing out flyers, inviting people, giving them a time, and then people coming. A lot of these were just tent cities, and hearing the gospel preached. This is from the chapel car log. This is the Messenger of the Peace, the one I saw, and it's these ones are mostly by Reverend Neil and his wife, and they're in Manning, Kansas, 1898. They built a building for a church. And then in Hamilton, Kansas, 1898, people hungry for the gospel. They spent 5 days there. In St. Louis, Missouri, in 1898, the exhibition at a station, the World Exposition. Then the last entry here, the last couple to take charge of this train car that I'm talking about, the Messenger of Peace. There's 7 total of these Baptist train cars, and they were on it for a number of years, and then they and the train car retired in 1947. You understand, World War II over now, people are starting to take more cars than they are than transportation by train. And the last train Baptist car, chapel car, in service in 1949. And it was sold for $400, and it was used as a roadside diner near Snohomish, Washington. Hey, thank you for watching Christians Going for the Gold. We have some fantastic testimonies lined up, so come back and hear some more. Please, if you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button and come back. We also want to tell you about our site. The things that are on this site are for sale on other sites, but this site, everything's free. It's a couple of Christian movies, a number of Christian ebooks, several helpful videos and short stories. It's uplifting, all Christian, and I think you'll be blessed by it. True Christian Short Stories by G.M. Matheny.